Pharmacodynamics involves the effects of the drugs. These effects result from drug receptor binding and signal transduction or interference with that transduction. In order to see an effect, the drug must reach the target at a concentration that exceeds the minimum effective concentration or toxic concentration if the effect in question is toxicity. Let's start by looking at our axes. X-axis, dose of drug, in this case morphine. Y-axis, percent of maximum effect or Emax. This graphic is looking at the dose-response curves for morphine. The blue line represents the analgesic effects, while the red line represents the respiratory depressant effects of morphine. The respiratory depressant effect is responsible for most deaths in the case of morphine overdose, so the red line really is a toxic dose of morphine. In pharmacodynamic dose-response curves, we look at the effect or efficacy, y-axis, as a function of the dose or concentration of drug in plasma or blood, x-axis. Emax is the maximum possible effect of a drug. ED50 is the dose needed to produce 50% of maximum effect, while TD50 is a dose needed to produce 50% of maximum toxic effect. When the x-axis is expressed in units of concentration, we'd say EC50 and TC50 instead of ED50 and TD50, but it's really the same relationship. The relationship between effect and concentration is a little bit complex. It's defined by the equation beneath the graphic, where E is the effect, Emax is the maximum effect, C is a concentration causing the E effect, and the EC50 is a concentration producing 50% of maximum effect. Doses or concentrations that extend beyond that needed to produce Emax are what cause toxic effects. The shape of the curve flattens out towards the top in part due to the limited number of receptors in any tissue and in part due to the law of mass action, where the affinity of the substance for the receptor determines the receptor occupancy at equilibrium. When interpreting a dose-response curve, efficacy is on the y-axis, while potency is on the x-axis. The smaller the dose or concentration required to produce 50% of Emax, the more potent the drug. For example, heroin is much more potent than morphine, since 2 milligrams of heroin produces the same effect as 10 milligrams of morphine. Most drugs produce their effects in the body by working on specific receptors. The shape of the drug molecule creates an affinity for the receptor that promotes drug binding to the receptor. A drug may either turn a receptor on, that would be an agonist, or a drug might prevent the endogenous substance, the ligand for the receptor, from turning the receptor on, making the drug an antagonist. Receptors may be enzymes or other proteins in the body, they might be lipids, they might even be DNA itself. Drug receptors have specificity for the binding of the drug molecules or the endogenous ligands that normally interact with them. When a drug or endogenous substance activates the receptor, it causes a structural change in the receptor, which in turn causes a change in function. Antibiotics target receptors in microorganisms. The more selective the antibiotic is for the microorganism, the fewer side effects we generally see. Not all drugs interact with receptors. Some drugs produce a local chemical action. A good example of this is calcium carbonate, TUMS, which reacts chemically with stomach acid to neutralize it. The figure depicts the schematic of the opioid receptor. Our endogenous opioids, known as endorphins, are represented by a whole key, and antagonists are represented by only the teeth of the key. The antagonist can't turn the lock. The red key represents an exogenous opioid, for example morphine. The antagonist can also outcompete exogenous agonists like morphine. In the induced fit theory of drug action, a drug with affinity for the receptor binds to the receptor in a reversible fashion. If the drug has intrinsic activity, it will turn the receptor on, but if the drug has only affinity, it will prevent the endogenous ligand from binding, and thus the drug will act as an antagonist. Drugs and endogenous substances may compete with one another for the binding site. The substance with a higher affinity will win. Kd is the dissociation constant, and it's the ratio of the dissociation constant K-1 to the association rate constant K1. The smaller the Kd, the greater the affinity of the substance for its receptor. There are two factors that determine the probability of a drug binding to its receptor. One is the Kd, and the other is the concentration of the drug. Drugs with affinity that lack activity are often antagonists of the endogenous ligand. They block activity of the endogenous ligand. Notice that's in red. Some receptors exist in a constitutively active form. They're turned on all the time, while others require interaction with an endogenous ligand or an exogenous agonist to become active. In order for a drug to be an agonist, it must have both affinity, binding to the receptor, and activity, causing that conformational change in the receptor that leads to activation. Full agonists bind to the receptor and changes it to the active conformation, producing 100% of Emax, the top line in the lower graphic. Partial agonists only turn on some of the receptors, the middle line in the lower graph, Antagonists have affinity but not activity, so that's the next to the bottom line in the graphic, while inverse agonists turn off constitutively active receptors, seen at the very bottom line in the lower graphic. Let's look at our axes. On our x-axis, we have the full agonist concentration. On the y-axis, we have Emax. The graphs depict the effect of a full agonist administered alone and with an antagonist. On the left, we see the impact of a competitive antagonist. When we increase the amount of full agonists and keep the amount of competitive antagonists fixed, we can outcompete the competitive antagonist and eventually, at high enough concentration of full agonists, attain 100% of Emax. On the right, we see a non-competitive antagonist combined with a full agonist. No matter how high the concentration of full agonist, we can't outcompete the non-competitive antagonist for receptor binding sites, so we never can get to 100% of Emax. Partial agonists can act like antagonists in the presence of a full agonist. A former student gave me this analogy for partial agonists acting as antagonists of full agonists. Full agonists are represented by 100-watt bulbs, partial agonists by 25-watt bulbs, and antagonists by shooting out the bulb with your BB gun, which I have done in the past. When you replace some of the 100-watt bulbs with some of the 25-watt bulbs, there's still light, but it's just not as bright. When you shoot out the bulbs, there's no light at all. Thus, if you add a partial agonist to a full agonist, you get less effect than the full agonist alone. In a patient dependent upon a drug, for example an opiate like morphine, if a partial agonist is administered, it will reduce the efficacy of the full agonist, outcompeting for receptors, and may precipitate withdrawal. So in the graphic we see the red line being methadone alone, the blue arrow addition of the partial agonist buprenorphine. We see a decrease in the efficacy of the red line, the methadone, when we added the partial agonist.